They mocked his damaged armor, until he took it off and the entire hall fell silent. The laughter started before he even reached the center of the hall. Sergeant Calvin Holt walked through the great archway of the Voakai Assembly Hall on the planet Drevis Prime, and the sound that greeted him was not the silence of diplomacy or the low murmur of a military gathering. It was laughter, open, contemptuous, and directed entirely at him. His armor was a wreck. There was no polite way to say it. The left pauldron had been sheared clean off during the ambush at Relay Station 9, leaving bare composite plating exposed underneath, all raw edges and torn fasteners. The chest piece had 3 deep gouge marks running diagonally from collarbone to ribs, cuts so deep that the underlayer of reactive mesh was visible through the gashes, gray-white and slightly frayed. The right gauntlet was missing 2 fingers entirely, snapped off during hand-to-hand combat with a Keth warrior twice his size, leaving the mechanical knuckles open to the air. And the helmet had a crack running from the left eye slit all the way up through the crown, sealed with emergency foam that had dried a faint orange color, a crude and obvious repair against the matte black of the rest of the suit. He had not been given time to change. The summons had come through 2 hours after the extraction from Relay Station 9, and the shuttle had taken him directly here. Nobody had offered him a replacement set. Nobody had even offered him a cloth to wipe the dried blood from the side of his neck, a thin line of it that had dried brown against the collar seal. He was aware of it. He had been aware of it since the shuttle. He had decided it did not matter. So he walked in as he was. The Voakai Assembly Hall was built to impress, which it accomplished without difficulty. The ceiling rose 30 meters above the main floor, carved from a single piece of pale native rock, its surface etched with patterns that caught and scattered the hall's indirect lighting. The floor was polished stone, the color of old ice, and it reflected the figures of everyone in the room in faint, wavering doubles. The acoustic design was precise enough that a whisper at the far end of the room was audible at the entrance, which meant that the first words Calvin heard upon entering were perfectly clear. "Is this what they send?" said a voice from the elevated seating tier, carrying on a current of light amusement. A human in a broken shell. More laughter followed, soft and unhurried, the kind of laughter produced by people who are not worried about being heard. The Voakai dignitaries sat in a curved tier of elevated seats carved from pale stone, their elongated bodies draped in layered robes of silver and deep violet. They were a tall species, lean, with wide-set amber eyes that caught light the way a cat's eyes did. They held themselves with the easy authority of beings who had been significant in galactic politics long before humans arrived, and they knew it, and they liked it, and they made sure it was visible in the way they occupied a room. The second ambassador, a being named Vethril Naz, sat at the center of the upper tier. He was older than the others, his robe a deeper shade of violet that indicated rank, and he had the specific kind of face that people grow when they have been important for a very long time. He was laughing openly, leaning slightly toward the delegate at his right to share some comment, amber eyes fixed on Calvin as he walked. Calvin kept walking. The floor was a long one. The center circle, marked by a ring of inlaid copper in the polished stone, was at least 60 meters from the archway. He covered it at the same pace he had walked in, neither faster nor slower, not adjusting his stride for the audience, not letting the laughter at his back speed his feet or stiffen his shoulders. To his left stood a cluster of observers from the Hain Collective, insectoid beings a full head shorter than the average human, their carapaces a deep iridescent blue that shifted with their movement. They communicated partly through a rapid clicking that their translation devices converted to speech, and partly through micro-movements of the plates along their upper thorax. Calvin had learned enough about Hain body language to read the cluster of plates now as something that did not have a direct human equivalent, but was closest to the feeling of standing near a fire whose size you are not yet certain of. They had not laughed, they had gone very still. To his right was a row of Drevari officials, the native species of this world, small and dense-bodied with dark skin that shimmered faintly under the hall lights, iridescent the way oil on water is iridescent. One of them, an older female named Counselor Dratha, watched Calvin approach with an expression he could not immediately read. Her eyes were steady and did not track to his armor, which he noted. He stopped at the center circle. The copper ring was warm-colored against the pale stone. He planted his boots at its edge, stood with his weight even, and looked up at the elevated tier. "Sergeant Calvin Holt," he said. His voice was flat and even, carrying easily across the hall without effort. 14th Human Expeditionary Corps. I was told there was a dispute to mediate. Vethrol Nas descended 2 steps from his elevated seat, which put him above Calvin but closer, the amber eyes looking down with the particular kind of disdain that only comes from someone who has never in their life had a reason to be afraid of anything placed in front of them. "A dispute, yes," the ambassador said, "between your species and ours regarding the mining rights to the Drevis outer belt. But I confess, Sergeant, I find it difficult to take this negotiation seriously when your government sends us a soldier who cannot even maintain his equipment." He gestured with one long hand, a flowing motion that took in the cracked helmet, the missing gauntlet fingers, the carved chest plate, the bare shoulder. "Is this how humans present themselves? Is this meant to be an insult?" Calvin looked at him for a long moment. He was aware of the silence in the hall, the way the laughter had settled into something more interested, the way every pair of eyes in the room was on him. "No," he said, "it is not an insult." He did not explain further, not yet. Vethrol Nas tilted his head, the amber eyes narrowing in a way that was not quite curiosity and not quite irritation. "Then explain the state of you, because from where I stand, you look like something that was dragged out of a refuse system." A ripple of Vorkai laughter moved through the assembled dignitaries again. 2 of the younger delegates exchanged glances. One of them, a pale-marked male near the end of the row, smiled openly. Calvin reached up and took off his cracked helmet. He held it under one arm. His face was steady, unsmiling, deeply tired in the specific way that only comes from not having slept for 36 hours, a tiredness that has moved past the shaking, urgent stage and settled into something almost peaceful. "3 days ago," he said, "a Keth raiding party hit Relay Station 9 in the outer system. The station houses the primary data archive for the mining survey of this entire region, including the outer belt you came here to negotiate rights to. The archive contains 11 years of geological mapping. Without it, the mining rights you want are worthless, because no one would know where to dig." He let that sit. The hall was quiet. "The Keth sent 40 warriors," Calvin continued. "The station was staffed by 9 people. 4 of them were researchers with no combat training. The security detail was 5 soldiers, including me." He paused just briefly. "The attack lasted 19 hours. He did not say anything else for a moment. To his left, the Hain cluster shifted with a soft clicking sound that the translation devices did not attempt to render. Counselor Dratha had leaned forward in her seat. "The archive survived," Calvin said. "All 9 people on the station survived. The Keth did not have a good day." He looked directly at Vethrol Nas. "That is why I am wearing damaged armor, Ambassador, because I have been busy." The great hall was very quiet. Vethrol Nas stared at him with those wide amber eyes, and something moved behind them, something that recalculated. Calvin set his cracked helmet down on the stone floor beside his feet. The sound it made was small, brief, and clear. "Now," he said, "shall we talk about the outer belt, or would anyone else like to comment on my equipment first?" No one said a word. The negotiation began. It took 4 hours, and it did not go smoothly. Diplomacy rarely does when resources are involved and pride is already engaged. But it did not fall apart either, which is sometimes the best you can ask for. Vethrol Nas spent the first hour establishing his technical position, which was more formidable than Calvin had expected. The Volcae had legitimate proximity claims to several sectors of the outer belt, based on survey work their own teams had conducted 16 years earlier, before the current human expedition had arrived in the system. Those claims were documented, registered, and entirely real. Dismissing them would have been dishonest and counterproductive, so Calvin did not dismiss them. He read the briefing files on the shuttle. He knew the counterarguments. He had read them twice on the flight over, once to understand them and once to stress test them, looking for the places where they were weakest. He laid them out without heat or hurry, point by point, referencing specific clauses in the Galactic Resource Accord and citing the human survey data that had been collected at Relay Station 9, the very data that had almost been destroyed 3 days ago. He worked from the established legal framework because that is what frameworks are for. The Volcae surveys were old. 16 years in a region as geologically active as the outer belt meant the data was partially obsolete. The human survey, 11 years of continuous monitoring and active mapping, was current. Under Article 7 of the Accord, current data took precedence over historical claims in active mineral regions. Vethril Nas challenged the geologic activity classification. Calvin cited the seismic index from the survey archive. The ambassador produced a counter-citation from a Volcae geological study. Calvin requested the reference number and cross-checked it against the archive's own data in real time, using a portable display unit that he had brought from the station and set up on the floor beside his helmet, right there on the copper inlay. The cross-check took 4 minutes. When it finished, the numbers supported the human position. Vethril Nas was very quiet for a moment after seeing those numbers. He was not a dishonest diplomat. That was important. He was proud and he was disdainful, and he had laughed at a man who had just finished 19 hours of continuous combat, which said something. But he was not dishonest. When the data did not support his position, he adjusted his position. He moved on to the secondary claims, which were stronger. There were sectors of the belt where the Volcae surveys were more recent and the human data less complete. Calvin conceded those sectors openly and without bargaining. He had been authorized to concede them before the negotiations started because the human priority was the primary belt, not the secondaries. Giving away something you were already willing to give up is not a concession. It is a signal. The signal was, I am not here to take everything. I am here to settle this. Vethril Nas received that signal. The pace of the negotiation changed after that, growing more technical and less adversarial. They were 2 people working through a problem instead of 2 representatives contesting territory, and that is a fundamentally different kind of meeting. During a recess in the second hour, Counselor Dratha pulled Calvin aside near one of the hall's great stone pillars. She was smaller than him by a head and a half, dense and contained, with the careful movements of someone who has spent a long time managing difficult rooms. She looked up at him with her shimmering dark face and said quietly, "You really defended the station, with only 4 others." 4 others plus me, Calvin said, a medic named Priya, 2 scout specialists named Cho and Akafer, a comms technician named Leon, and our unit lead, Lieutenant Hara, who took a blade to the shoulder in hour 3 and still managed the defensive grid for another 16 hours from her chair. Dratha was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving across his face in the careful way of someone who is deciding how much they believe what they are hearing. "The Volcae do not understand humans," she said finally. "Most species don't," Calvin said. It was not pride in his voice. It was just a fact, stated the way you might state that it always rains in November. "They thought the damaged armor meant weakness," Dratha said. "I know. They were wrong. I know that too." She looked at him a moment longer, measuring something that did not have a name. Then she nodded, a slow and deliberate movement. "Humanity will have Drevari support in this negotiation, Sergeant," she said, "for what it is worth." It was worth quite a lot, as it turned out. When the session resumed, Counselor Dratha guided two other Dravari officials into a joint position alongside the human proposal. They cited the survey data's validity and the transparent logic of the primary belt priority. The Hain Collective, who had been neutral through the first 2 hours, shifted incrementally in the same direction, their lead delegate making a careful statement about the value of current geological data in disputed resource adjudications. Vethrel Naz was now negotiating from a retreating position. He did it with skill, it was worth noting. He did not panic or overcommit. He carved out the strongest secondary claims and held to them firmly, letting the primary belt go in stages rather than all at once, which preserved the appearance of active contest and gave him something to report back to the Voakai High Assembly that was not simply defeat. Calvin let him have it. A deal that leaves everyone with something tends to hold longer than one that leaves someone with nothing. By the time the final hour arrived, they had the shape of an agreement. The human expedition retained the primary belt and the major mineral deposits within it. The Voakai secured a formal stake in 3 secondary sectors, with provisions for joint survey access in 2 buffer zones. The Dravari retained oversight rights over any extraction activity within their home system, which they had always had, but appreciated seeing written out explicitly. The agreement was signed, not on paper but registered into the Hall's diplomatic record system, countersigned by all parties. The record would go to the Galactic Resource Authority within 48 hours, after which it would be binding. Calvin picked up his cracked helmet from the floor where he had left it. The hall was beginning to disperse, delegates and officials separating into small groups, the long process of informal conversation that follows any formal agreement. The sound level rose to a low hum of voices. Vethrel Naz approached him. The ambassador moved differently than he had at the start of the session. The disdain was gone, that particular quality of certainty that had been so audible in his laughter when Calvin walked in. What had replaced it was harder to name. Not warmth, not quite respect either. Something between those two things, new and slightly uncomfortable, the expression of someone adjusting to information they had not expected. "I was mistaken," Vethrel Naz said. The words were deliberate, they did not come easily, that was visible. "About the armor," the ambassador said, "I thought it meant your government did not respect this negotiation enough to prepare properly for it. I thought it was carelessness or contempt." "And now," Calvin said, "now I understand that it meant your government sent the person who had just prevented the entire factual basis for this negotiation from being destroyed." The ambassador paused, choosing his next words with the precision of someone who means them. "That is a different thing entirely." "Yes," Calvin said, "it is." Vethrel Naz looked at the helmet under Calvin's arm, the orange sealant, the crack that ran from eye slit to crown. "I did not know the context." "Most people don't," Calvin said, "until they ask." He walked out of the hall into the dry afternoon air of Drevis Prime, the cracked helmet tucked under his arm, the pale local sunlight catching the orange-sealed crack in the crown. His comm pinged, a message from back at the station. 3 words from Priya, no punctuation, the way medics always wrote because their hands were usually occupied. "Archive is fine." Calvin put the comm back in his pocket and kept walking. The shuttle that would take him back was waiting at the landing pad 2 kilometers from the assembly hall. The walk took him through a stretch of Drevis Prime's old city, where the buildings were stone and the streets were narrow, and the trees that grew along them had silver-gray leaves that moved in the light afternoon wind with a sound that was almost like water. He walked without hurry. He had been moving fast for 4 days, the planning session before the Keth hit, 19 hours of the fight itself, 2 hours of extraction and debrief, 2 hours on the shuttle to Drevis Prime, 4 hours of negotiation, and the body has ways of noticing when it is finally allowed to slow down. His feet hurt in a way they had not during the fighting. His right hand, the one with the 2 missing gauntlet fingers, was beginning to ache in its exposed knuckles in the dry air. The dressing on his neck was pulling at the edge. He stopped once, at a public water station set into a low stone wall along the street, and drank for a long time. The water was cold and had a mineral taste that was specific to this planet, something in the local aquifer. He had drunk it twice before on prior visits, and he found he did not mind it. A small Dravari child drifted over from the other side of the street and stood a few feet away, watching him with the particular openness that children of many species share. Curious and entirely undefended, with none of the social filters that adults apply to strangers. The child was maybe 6 years old in human terms, dense and round-faced, with skin that shimmered between brown and gold as she moved. Her eyes were large and fixed on his armor with the intense attention children give to broken things, because broken things are interesting and unbroken things are not. She looked at the gouged chest plate, the missing gauntlet fingers, the orange-sealed crack in the helmet he held under his arm. "Did you fight?" the child asked. Her Dravari was light and rapid, and his implant translated it with only a slight delay. "Yes," Calvin said. "Did you win?" He thought about that for a moment. He thought about what winning looks like at the far end of 19 hours. He thought about Priya managing a shoulder wound with one hand while coordinating a medical response with the other, sitting on the floor of the med bay with her back against a storage cabinet because she had not had time to find a chair. He thought about Cho and Akafar, the 2 scouts, who had rotated barrier duty for 12 hours straight, sleeping in 10-minute increments against the wall of the archive corridor, waking each other by tapping a boot on an ankle, no words because there was no point using energy on words. He thought about Leon, the comms technician, who had kept the distress signal running even after a Keth concussion grenade had taken out half the communications panel, who had jury-rigged a bypass with a data cable and a section of his own equipment belt. 2 minutes of absolutely focused thinking in a room full of smoke, and then the signal was back up and running. He thought about the archive room door, sealed and intact at hour 19 when the Keth withdrew. "Yes," Calvin said. The child looked at the damaged armor one more time and then back up at his face and nodded. It was a slow, serious nod, the kind only young children produce, with the full weight of their attention behind it. "Good," the child said and walked away. Calvin watched her go. Then he put his helmet back on, the orange-sealed crack pointing up at the pale sky, and walked the rest of the way to the shuttle. The pilot was a civilian contractor, a heavy-set man named Owen who flew diplomatic runs between the station and Drevis Prime twice a week. He had been waiting by the landing pad for 6 hours. He did not complain about this. He simply handed Calvin a sealed ration pack and a bottle of water and said, "I figured you might not have eaten." Calvin had not, in fact, eaten since the extraction from the station. He sat in the co-pilot seat and ate the ration pack on the way up through the atmosphere, watching Drevis Prime fall away below him, its pale surface and the distant glitter of the outer belt. Owen did not ask about the negotiation or the armor. He was a man who understood that some things did not require comment. They flew in comfortable silence for most of the trip, with only the routine chatter of clearance protocols and navigation pings filling the cabin. When they were 40 minutes out from the station, Owen said, without taking his eyes from the approach path, "Heard about the raid." "Word travels," Calvin said. 9 people, Owen said. 19 hours. He shook his head once slowly. "That is a long time." "It was," Calvin said. Owen said nothing else. The station came up on the approach display, a structure of modules and connectors that looked both solid and fragile against the black, the way all human-built things in space did. As they got closer, the damage became visible. Patched hull sections, missing antenna arrays, the dark scarring around the fabrication bay where the direct hit had occurred. But the lights were on throughout, all of them. Calvin looked at that as they came in to dock. He had not been sure during the fight that the lights would still be on when it was done. That was the honest version of how it had felt. He had not been afraid exactly, but he had been aware of the possibility, and he had set it to the side and kept working. That was all you could do. Set the possibility to the side and keep working, and deal with what happened after it was over. The lights were on. That meant they had made it to the after. Owen brought the shuttle in smooth and clean, and the docking clamps engaged with a solid double thunk, and Calvin unbuckled his harness and picked up his helmet and went back aboard. Back on the station, the damage was worse than it looked from the reports. Reports are written by people who are exhausted, working from memory, using shorthand and approximation, because at the end of 19 hours no one has the energy for detail. Calvin had written his own field notes during the extraction and they were sparse. Accurate but sparse. Walking the station now, seeing it with fresh eyes after the hours away, filled in all the parts that the sparse notes had left out. 14 hull breaches had been patched with emergency foam and magnetic sealant. That was what the reports said. What the reports did not adequately convey was the smell of the sealant, which was chemical and sharp, still heavy in the air in the corridors near the breaches, or the way the foam had sprayed through the gaps and then hardened in irregular shapes that the crew had left in place, because removing them now would mean reopening the seals, and they were not yet at that stage of repairs. The main corridor on Deck 2 had a scorch pattern that ran for 30 meters. The ceiling panels melted down to the struts in places where a Keth sustained fire weapon had tracked along the wall. The exposed struts were still black with the heat. Someone had zip-tied a string of emergency lighting along the corridor to replace the panels that were gone, and the lights ran in a line that bent slightly where the tie points had not been perfectly level, which gave the corridor a strange, informal quality, like a hallway in a home rather than a military installation. 3 of the defensive turrets were completely gone, not damaged but physically removed from their mountings by concentrated Keth fire. The mountings themselves were still there, circular rings of metal with nothing in them, which was in some ways stranger than wreckage would have been. The fabrication bay had taken a direct hit at hour 11 and was now a room full of twisted metal and ceramic fragments that would need to be gutted and completely rebuilt. The equipment inside had been worth a great deal. It was now worth nothing except as material for recycling, if they could sort through the wreckage to find pieces large enough to be worth sorting. But the archive room was intact. The door was still sealed, the lock still registering green, the climate control system still cycling, the soft hum of the data cores still audible if you put your ear close to the door. Calvin stood outside the archive room for a long time after he returned. Just stood there, in the corridor that smelled of sealant foam and old smoke, with the string of zip-tied emergency lights casting their uneven glow, and he let himself be still. He thought about the negotiation in the great stone hall. He thought about Vethrolnaz laughing. He thought about the amber eyes looking down at the cracked helmet, the missing gauntlet fingers, the gouge marks in the chest plate. He understood why the ambassador had laughed, not excused it but understood it. The Volkai were a species for whom appearance was a form of communication, where the condition of a thing told you what it was worth and what kind of effort had gone into it. A damaged armor in their reading was a neglected armor, and a neglected armor meant a soldier who did not take his duty seriously, and a soldier who did not take his duty seriously meant a government that was not prioritizing this meeting. The reading was wrong, but it was not irrational. It was just a framework applied to a situation the framework had not been designed for. Calvin thought about frameworks. The Volkai framework said damaged equals neglected. A different framework said damaged equals active. A third framework said damaged equals survived. The third one was the right one, in this case. Priya found him there, standing in the corridor outside the archive room door. She was in clean clothes now, off-duty ones, with her right arm in a proper medical sling. The field wrap was gone, replaced by a structured support that immobilized the shoulder at the precise angle needed for the wound to heal correctly. She had combed her hair. which was notable only because during the 19 hours it had been pulled back in a knot that had gradually come apart until the last few hours when she had simply stopped managing it. She looked at him the way medics look at people when they are assessing, without wanting to look like they are assessing. "How did it go?" she asked. "We got the outer belt rights," Calvin said. She leaned against the corridor wall, settling her weight carefully on the side away from the sling. "Did they give you a hard time?" "At first. Because of the armor." "Because of the armor. What changed it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Context," he said. "Once they knew the context, the conversation changed." Priya was quiet for a moment. Counselor Dratha sent a message to Hara. She said the Vorkai ambassador laughed when you walked in. "He did. And then you told them about the station." "Yes." "And the laughter stopped." "Yes." She was looking at him with the focused attention she used for difficult cases, and he recognized the expression. "You are not angry about it," she said. "No. You should be a little, at least a little." "Maybe," he said, "but it did not help anything, and the negotiation needed me focused." Priya considered that, and he could see her deciding whether to argue with it or let it go. She let it go. "I need to change your neck dressing," she said. "You have dried blood on your collar." "I know. Come to the med bay." He followed her down the corridor, past the string of zip-tied lights, past the scorch marks on the ceiling, past the turret mountings with nothing in them. In the med bay, she sat him on the examination cot and worked on his neck with the efficient precision of someone who had long since stopped being intimidated by the details of physical damage. She peeled the old dressing away, cleaned the wound beneath it, which was a 10-centimeter laceration from a keth blade that had caught him in the gap between his neck seal and his shoulder plate, assessed it, and applied a fresh dressing with the same focused quiet she brought to everything clinical. She also, while she was at it, cleaned and redressed the abrasion across the knuckles of his right hand, and rebandaged 2 fingertips on his left that he had not even mentioned because they had seemed minor. "You have a minor concussion," she said, stepping back and recording something in her medical log. "I know," he said. "You knew during the negotiation." "Yes." She looked at him, "And you did not think that was relevant information to share." "It did not affect my function." "I am the one who decides whether it affected your function," she said, in a tone that was not angry but was extremely clear. "Not you." "Fair," he said. "Sleep," she said. "Actual sleep. 8 hours minimum, not 4 hours in a corridor with your hand on your sidearm." "I will," he said. She pointed at the row of medical cots at the far end of the bay. He lay down on one of them, still in his damaged armor, because taking it off required energy he did not currently have, and it was not the first time he had slept fully suited. Priya draped a thermal sheet over him without being asked, the same way she did everything useful, without commentary. He was unconscious in under a minute. He dreamed, or something like dreaming happened in the way it does when the body is so tired that even sleep is simplified. There was a room, plain and featureless, and in the center of it a small, steady light. He stood at the edge of the light and looked at it. It did not flicker. The room was quiet. That was all. He woke up 8 hours later to the sound of the station's standard rotation alarm, a soft 2-tone sound that played 3 times and then stopped. He lay on the cot for a moment and took stock of himself. Shoulder, sore but functional. Ribs, bruised, not broken. Right hand, dressed and clean. Neck, dry dressing sealed. Head, clearer than it had been in 4 days. Someone had cleaned his helmet and set it on the supply shelf beside the cot. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. The crack was still there, the orange sealant was still holding, but the exterior had been wiped down and the eye slits were clear of the grit and smoke residue that had built up over the 19 hours. He did not know who had done it, but he knew it had been done carefully, and the thought of that carefulness did something small and warm in his chest that he was not going to analyze. He got up, put his helmet under his arm, and went to find Hara. Lieutenant Hara was in the command center, which was where she was most of the time, and she was running the repair schedule on 2 displays simultaneously, which was how she operated when she was in a hurry to get things done. Her shoulder was immobilized in a rigid medical brace, the shoulder of her left arm, and she was using her right hand to manage both displays, which required occasional stretches across to the farther screen that looked uncomfortable but which she did not appear to notice. "You slept," she said without looking up. "8 hours," he said. "Good." She glanced at him then, a quick scan from boots to helmet, the automatic assessment of a unit lead. The neck. Clean dressing, Priya checked it. The ribs. Bruised, not structural. Concussion. He paused. "I already saw the medical log," she said. "Minor," she said, "but you need to flag those going forward. That is not optional." "Understood," he said. "Good." She turned back to the repair schedule. The agreement go through. Registered and countersigned. 48 hours to GRA confirmation. Primary belts. Hours. The Volkai get 3 secondary sectors and joint survey access in 2 buffer zones. She was quiet for a moment, reviewing something on the left display. "That is better than the pre-briefing projected." "The data was strong," he said. "The data is what you kept alive," she said. It was said the same way she said most things, flatly, as a statement of fact. Not praise exactly, just accuracy. "We all kept it alive," he said. "Yes," she said. "We did." She tapped something into the display. "Cho and Akafor are on light duty until the medical sign-off. Leon is running comms diagnostics. I'm trying to get the fabrication bay cleared for assessment so we can figure out the rebuild cost." She looked up at him again. "I need you on the hull breach inspections when you are ready. There are 14 patches and I want a second set of eyes on each one before we certify them as permanent." "I can start now," he said. "Eat first," she said. He went to eat first. In the mess hall, which had been cleared of the emergency supplies that had taken over 3 of its tables during the fight, he found Cho and Akafor already sitting at one of the remaining tables, both of them with food in front of them, and the specific look of people who have recently slept for a very long time. Cho had a bandaged forearm. Akafor had dark circles under his eyes that would take more than one long sleep to clear. They both looked at him when he came in, and there was a moment of something unspoken that moved between the 3 of them. The kind of thing that does not require words because words would only make it smaller. Calvin got his food from the dispenser and sat down. "How was the planet?" Akafor said. "Nice building," Calvin said. "Cold floor." Cho looked at his helmet, at the orange sealant on the crack. "They give you trouble." "For about 30 seconds," Calvin said. Akafor snorted softly, and then it stopped. They ate in companionable quiet after that, the 3 of them in the mess hall that smelled faintly of smoke and strongly of the meal dispenser's best attempt at a hot breakfast, while the station moved through the dark outside, lit up and running, with the archive humming in its sealed room and the repairs ongoing, and the crew finding their way back to the ordinary rhythms of living after something extraordinary had happened to them all. It was a good breakfast. After Calvin started on the hull breach inspections. 3 months after the negotiation on Drevis Prime, a Volkai delegation arrived at Relay Station 9. Not Vethral Nas, a different group and noticeably younger, 3 junior diplomats whose robes were lighter in color and who moved with the less settled quality of people who are still working out who they want to be in a room. With them was an engineer, a technical specialist named Kethurvo, who had been assigned to begin the Volkai side of the joint survey access in the secondary belt sectors. They came with the correct documentation and gave the correct introductions and were, in all observable ways, professional. Kethurvo in particular was focused and specific, asking precise questions about the survey methodology and the data archive structure with the intent efficiency of someone whose interest was entirely technical. Calvin was not the one who received them. He was on the lower level, working with Cho on the final stages of the fabrication bay rebuild, specifically on rerouting a power conduit that had been damaged in the attack, and that kept causing intermittent failures in the new equipment during calibration. The conduit routing was meticulous work. You could not rush it. Each connection point needed to be checked before the next one was established, and the diagnostic had to run clean at every stage before you moved forward, because a partial failure in this section would cascade through the entire bay and you would have to start over. Calvin did it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. Complete, careful, no stages skipped. It took most of the day. He heard about the delegation afterward from Hara, who delivered information the way she always did, in motion, walking from one place to another while she talked, expecting you to keep pace. The junior diplomat asked who defended the station during the Keth raid, Hara said, moving down the corridor toward the command center. What did you tell them? Calvin said, keeping up. That it was a 5-person unit. Full names, ranks, roles, the whole picture. Good. The diplomat said he had heard it was one soldier. She glanced at him sideways. That is not accurate, Calvin said. That is exactly what I told him. She pushed the command center door open. Word travels strangely in this part of the system. I don't know where the story started. Someone probably heard the extraction report and summarized it badly. She sat down in her chair. It tends to happen. It does, he said. I corrected it, she said, gave them the accurate version. He nodded, and Kethervo, the engineer. Hara looked up at him with something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. He asked to see the archive room, she said. Calvin waited. He stood in there for a while, Hara said. He did not touch anything, just looked at the cores, looked at the climate system, walked the perimeter of the room slowly. She paused. When he came out, he asked me how long the attack lasted. What did you say? I said 19 hours. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had not understood before what had been protected or at what cost. She looked at her display, then back at him. He said he was glad it had survived. Calvin was quiet. I thought you would want to know, Hara said. Thank you, he said. He left the command center and walked back toward the lower level. There was still a check to run on the new conduit before end of shift. One final diagnostic to confirm the power flow was clean and stable through the full route. He ran it carefully, the way you run the last check on something, when you know it is the last one and you want to get it right. The diagnostic took 40 minutes. When it finished, every point was green, the power flow was stable, and the fabrication bay came up to full calibration for the first time since the attack. Calvin stood in the doorway of the bay and watched the machines run for a moment. The new equipment was not quite the same as what had been destroyed. It was newer in some ways and less specialized in others. But it was running, and the bay was functioning, and the station was whole in a way it had not been in 3 months. He stood there for a little while and let himself look at it. Then he went to find Priya for the follow-up appointment she had reminded him about 4 times. She was in the med bay finishing a notes entry when he came in. She looked at him, looked at the clock on her display, and said with no particular expression, "You are 12 hours late." "I know," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat on the examination cot and she checked his ribs, which had healed cleanly, and the neck laceration, which had sealed well and would leave a thin scar but nothing structural, and the concussion, which was resolved. "You are cleared," she said, writing in her log. "Full duty." "Thank you," he said. She looked up at him. Outside the med bay window, Drevis Prime was a pale shape against the dark of space, its outer belt a faint shimmer of light and rock and ice, ancient and patient. "The archive is still intact," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. He picked up his helmet and stood up. Priya had already turned back to her notes. He looked at her for a moment, at the competent, quiet focus she brought to everything she did, and thought about the medic who had managed a shoulder wound with one hand while running a medical response with the other for 16 hours straight. "Priya," he said. She looked up. "Good work," he said. "On the station, all of it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "You too," and looked back at her notes. He walked out of the med bay into the corridor. In the corridor outside the archive room, still mounted on the emergency data screen where someone had written it in marker during the fight or just after, the message was still there. 9 people, 19 hours, everything intact. No one had erased it. No one was going to. Calvin looked at it for a moment, standing in the corridor that had been repaired now, the ceiling panels replaced and the scorch marks painted over, the zip-tied string of lights long since removed and replaced with proper fixtures. The corridor was clean and functional and looked the way it was supposed to look. But the message was still on the screen. He thought about 6 weeks ago, when the Volkai engineer Kethervo had stood in the archive room and looked at the cores. He thought about the delegation's junior diplomat asking who had defended the station. He thought about Counselor Dratha and the way she had said that word travels strangely and meant something kind by it. He thought about a great stone hall and a man laughing. He thought about the moment when the laughter stopped. There is a specific quality to the silence that follows a room's understanding. It is not the silence of embarrassment, though embarrassment might be part of it. It is not the silence of awe, though something like awe might be present. It is the silence of recalibration, of a room full of minds simultaneously revising a picture they had already finished painting and realizing they had been working with the wrong colors. That silence in the Volkai Assembly Hall had been one of the most complete things Calvin had experienced in his career. Not satisfying exactly, more like accurate. The world had rearranged itself into the correct order, and the room had gone quiet while that happened. 6 weeks later, a message arrived through the diplomatic channel, addressed to Calvin by name and rank and station, carrying the Volkai government seal in the header. It was from Vethrol Naz. Calvin read it in the mess hall. The ambassador had written it personally, not through a secretary, which was visible in the slightly less formal sentence structure, and in the places where he had clearly revised his wording and then continued rather than starting over. Vethrol Naz wrote that he had shared the details of the Relay Station 9 defense with several members of the Volkai High Assembly. He wrote that their reaction had been, in his careful phrasing, sobering. He wrote that there was a concept in Volkai culture that translated approximately as earned silence, a specific form of acknowledgement given to someone whose actions speak so completely that any commentary from outside would only diminish them. He wrote that this concept was rarely extended to species beyond the Volkai themselves, because it required a particular kind of direct understanding that cross-species interactions did not often produce. The last paragraph was short and direct. The Volkai High Assembly extends earned silence to the human soldiers of Relay Station 9. We did not know the context before. We do now. That is a debt of understanding, and we do not take debts lightly. Calvin read it twice. He forwarded it to the unit without any added text, just the message itself. Priya responded in her characteristic style, a single mark that meant something without quite being a word. The scouts sent nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Leon wrote back 4 words with no punctuation. Archive is still fine. Hara, in a separate message, simply replied, "Good." Calvin put his comm away. He thought about the negotiation and the armor and the laughter and the silence that followed. He thought about 19 hours. He thought about a child on a Drevari street saying good with the full weight of her attention behind it. He thought about a Volkai engineer standing quietly in an archive room, looking at data cores, understanding something without being told. Context changes everything when you let it. He had a hull maintenance review in 20 minutes. He finished his meal, cleared his tray, and went to start his shift. In the corridor outside the archive room, The message on the emergency data screen was still there, unchanged. The marker letters dried into permanence in their small block characters. 9 people, 19 hours, everything intact. It was enough, more than enough. It was the kind of thing that earns its place on a wall and stays there. The station turned in the dark, its lights on, its archive running, its crew at work. Outside the viewports, the outer belt moved in its long and patient orbit, stone and ice and mineral light, 4 billion years old and entirely indifferent to the question of who had the rights to it. The answer to that question was settled now, registered and confirmed, secured by 11 years of careful data and 19 hours of something that did not have a simple name, something that lived between endurance and certainty, and the specific kind of love that makes a person stand between a thing worth protecting and everything that wants to destroy it. Calvin Holt walked down the corridor toward the maintenance review. The lights were on. They had been on since the morning after the fight. They stayed on.